In order to be able to terminate employment in India, you need to have a cause. And that cause in India is broadly broken up into two buckets. There's termination simpliciter and termination which is stigmatic. Three categories that you'd see that form part of termination simpliciter is termination for poor performance, termination for redundancies, and terminations for loss of faith. What I'd like to specifically talk about a little more is terminations on account of redundancy in India. The Industrial Disputes Act, along with the Shops and Establishments Act that applies in every state, are the key pieces of legislation. When you try to apply the law, there are two broad categories of people that you need to consider. There is somebody who's called a workman, and there are people who fall outside of this category. And each of these categories have a separate process that needs to be followed. The term workman, and in the way it's defined under the Industrial Disputes Act, is actually very broad. Only exceptions to this definition are people in a managerial position and a supervisory position. Most other people, I would say about 90% of all workforces actually are covered within the definition of workman. Before you consider doing a redundancy in India, the law actually has a concept of something called LIFO, last in, first out. The idea is that you have to terminate the person who came in last, first. You can't cherry pick the people based on performance, fundamentally. Now, there are limited deviations that are allowed on this, but that's largely on account of efficiency, and you really need to prove a business case to be able to show that somebody falls outside of that category. The Industrial Disputes Act requires that you have to give notice to an employee and pay them a severance amount. The absence of following these two things could potentially make the termination itself void. Now, you do have the ability within the law to actually buy out that notice. The other thing that is perhaps useful to understand is that the Industrial Disputes Act itself is broken up into two chapters. There's Chapter 5A and 5B. Now, the moment you get into Chapter 5B, the whole process becomes actually far more difficult, because you actually need to go back to the government and take prior permission before you can terminate even one person. Now, under Chapter 5A, you don't need to go to the government for permission. All you need to ensure is that post facto notice is given to the government in terms of a notification letting them know that I've made this many people redundant and I've paid out all of their service dues. The process of redundancy termination in India can actually be fairly intimidating when you first start the exercise. This is largely on account of the complexity within the law itself. The most practical way to try and deal with redundancies is for companies to either roll out something called a voluntary separation scheme, and you'll find that that's commonly used as a method. The other method that is used in India is for employers to literally sit across the table with the employee and say that your role has become redundant. We'll give you an opportunity to resign. As long as you set your sort of processes in place, be as flexible as you can, and you've got a good team to back you, that's when you'll find it becomes much easier to actually follow through with these terminations.